Hello and welcome to Cut Through, Crikey's spin-free analysis of Australian news, politics and power. I'm your host, Crystal Andrews, and I'm joined by our reporter-at-large, Charlie Lewis, to talk about Zohran Mamdani's incredible win in the New York City mayoral election. We are going to unpack what this means for the Democrats, what it means for the fight against Trump, and what it means for left-wing politics in Australia. Charlie, are you feeling sufficiently Zohran-filled for this conversation?
I mean, I'm not sure if there is a sufficient level of Zoran pilling at this time in history. This is obviously a day after we've had the result, but I'll do my best.
There can never, ever be enough. Before we get into the meat of this discussion, I'll just do a quick little bit of housekeeping. We're going to do this episode in roughly two halves. So in the first half, we'll talk about Mamdani's win in the US context and what that means. And in the second half, we'll talk about what parts of this are applicable to Australia, if any. I'll mark the timestamps for each of those parts in the episode description. So if you want to listen to just one half or the other, you can click and quickly do that. Obviously, I would rather that you listen to our whole amazing conversation in full, but that's a favor I will do for all of you listening. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. This week, the 34-year-old Zohran Mamdani was elected as the mayor of New York. He is a Democrat who is part of the Democratic Socialist of America, known as the DSA, and campaigned on freezing rents, making the buses fast and free, introducing free childcare, city-run grocery stores, and a 2% wealth tax on the uber wealthy. Mamdani won 50% of the vote, beating out the disgraced establishment Democrat and former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Now, Cuomo lost the Democratic primary to Mamdani earlier in the year, but he decided to run as an independent anyway and ended up with about 41% of the vote. The Republican candidate Curtis Sliwa was also there. He also ran. He got about 7% of the vote himself. But New York is very much a blue city through and through, so I don't think that result is particularly notable, even though it seems like a very small number. Now, Charlie, I think for a lot of people, this mayoral campaign really represented a battle within the Democratic Party itself. Obviously, the head-to-head was not a Democrat and Republican. It was a Democrat versus kind of a Democrat/independent. You had this old guard of the centrist wealthy elite that was represented by Cuomo versus the new guard represented by Mamdani in this class-conscious emergent left of the party who want the party to be more aggressive and more ambitious in what it's trying to do. But do you think the Democrats themselves actually saw this contest that way, especially now that we know who ultimately was victorious? Like, is this just projection from the rest of us in what we hoped them to see in the contest?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think there are two ways to answer it. One is obviously following on from your intro. How could they interpret it any other way? This is a young person of color, a democratic socialist, running on a very explicitly materially left platform, as well as a culturally one. And you mentioned Cuomo there, obviously, but also the other person to mention in all this is Eric Adams, the previous Democratic mayor of New York, who had run on as a Democrat, but quite a right-wing Democrat platform, you would say. He was a former cop, and he did a lot of work on law and order, vowing to clean up, cracking down on the homeless, reinstating NYPD units who had been disbanded over police brutality concerns, particularly racially motivated, or at least racially targeted police brutality concerns. And of course, he had to quit because he became the first New York mayor to be criminally charged while in office, which, if you know a bit about the history of local city politics in New York, that's actually quite an achievement to become the first guy to actually manage that. The charges against him were eventually dismissed. The Department of Justice under Donald Trump argued that the charges should be dropped because it would interfere with Adams' ability to assist the Department of Justice implementing Trump's very hardline immigration policies. And Eric Adams quite clearly cultivated that relationship. It was in the aftermath of those charges that Mamdani announced that he was going to run. And of course, then we have Cuomo, who is, I mean, as democratic establishment as you could conceivably get. He's a former member of Bill Clinton's administration. He himself was a governor of New York. Also, he's a dynastic kind of member of the Democratic Party. His father, Mario, was also a New York governor. Cuomo, as you mentioned, kind of had to quit the governorship in disgrace because roughly a dozen women came forward with varying allegations of sexual harassment against Cuomo. There's also a lot of concerns about the way that he handled the COVID pandemic in New York during his time as governor. So with all that laid on the table, you would have to argue that there's no other interpretation that this is a repudiation of a certain way that the Democrats have approached politics in the last however long, last decades or so, and that Mamdani's success is a vindication of that repudiation, if that sentence makes any sense whatsoever. I have a horrible suspicion that the Democratic leadership, the wider Democratic leadership, will go out of their way to ignore that lesson. And I think there's a few ways that will happen. The big element, I would say, is that we're obviously talking about New York City, and that's probably the most interesting of the races. But there are a number of elections on Tuesday, and the Democrats did quite well in all of them. They won quite comfortably the gubernatorial races in Virginia and New Jersey. There was a major, another interesting kind of thread to all this is that a ballot initiative got through in California, which is basically going to allow the Democrats to gerrymander themselves into 5 or so potentially extra seats. That's part of
the Prop 50.
That's correct.
50 vote.
Yes,
if people have heard that term being thrown around, that's exactly what it refers to.
Yeah, and this is a continuation of a long-standing and accelerating battle between the two major parties to basically consolidate their power via the process of gerrymandering, the electoral zoning that will allow them to sort of lock in seats to split and group the opposing votes. So I think that gives them a chance. That gives the Democrats much more nebulous, feel-good headlines. The New York Times ran this sort of like the Democrats start to get their groove back. You know, the anti-Trump kind of movement has begun, and because of the kind of spread of those victories, the Democrat leadership, who are very, very what's the word I'm looking for here? Very skeptical about a figure like Mamdani, can argue, well, look, New York is a very distinct polity, which is true to a degree, and more moderate voices like Abigail Spanberger in Virginia also did really well. But again, we can get into a bit about the details of those different campaigns and why they worked in different ways.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because watching some of the coverage, the rolling coverage from the states as all of the results from all of these various elections were coming out. Spanberger in Virginia, the way that they were talking about, I should say, the way some of the commentators were talking about her win and that this is actually the future of the party, the way that they were talking about her and Virginia, I had thought that Virginia must have voted for Trump at the 2024 presidential election, but it hadn't. It had voted for Kamala Harris. And so even though this, I mean, it's a good thing for the Democrats to win any of these elections, I did think it was quite interesting that they were really eager to hype up winning a governor spot in a place where you could argue even in the disastrous election of 2024, they kind of already had that one on lock. So it shouldn't necessarily be represented as like this huge swinging change the way that it was being talked about. But, it's possible that was just the commentary that I happened to hear about it that afternoon. But they certainly wanted to put the emphasis there rather than on Mamdani and New York City, which, of course, is just the city as well.
Yes, and for sure. And I think it's also, I suppose, if you want to mount that argument, you have to probably acknowledge that New York would vote for a banana with a face carved in it before it would vote for a Republican at the moment. But obviously, the circumstances of Mamdani's victory are a bit different because he was up against an independent, but obviously with the kind of backing of a certain sect of the Democratic movement.
Yeah, we had independent journalist Jesse Noakes from The Last Place on Earth on the ground in New York reporting on this election for Crikey, and I'll link to some of his pieces again in the episode description because they are absolutely worth a read. His interview with Curtis Sliwa is fantastic value. Everybody should read it. On election night, he was at a DSA party in Astoria, which is Mamdani's home neighborhood, but I asked him to send over just his sort of insights and take on, how Trump was looming over this election, the way that he seems to loom over everything in politics these days. So here is Jesse's take on it.
I think it's pretty clear that the result last night should be seen in the context of Donald Trump's presidency. It's the first real backlash to that. Last night was the first time the Overton window opened up the other way. We've seen a lot of right-wing populism in America and elsewhere around the world. Obviously, I think Zohran Mamdani's candidacy and his win last night really shows that a left-wing populism that speaks to working people about core issues in a very measured, serious and studied way does cut through. Donald Trump was out the gates immediately, tweeting up a storm on Truth Social last night. At the party we were at, anytime the president's face or output came up on screen, there were chants of "fuck Donald Trump," there were loud boos, but that was also the case when Chuck Schumer came up on screen. There's no love for the Democratic establishment here either. In fact, I think it's probably fair to say that the loudest boos of the night early on, before the votes were counted, were for Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer at the Democratic Socialist event last night. So there's clearly a schism in the Democratic Party. Now it's time to see how he goes up against Donald Trump. Trump already talking about cutting federal funds. One of the big chants last night and at previous Mamdani rallies was tax the rich. Now, that's not gone down too well with the president. It'll be really interesting to see what he does in terms of an ongoing federal shutdown, whether federal funds start getting frozen. Also, obviously, Trump's been sending the National Guard into American cities elsewhere around the country. He's talked about doing it here as well. He's talked about arresting Mamdani. Mamdani had a really direct message for the president last night. 4 simple words: turn the volume up. He knew that Trump was watching. He was speaking directly to him. He made it very clear that he's not backing down. He's presenting a very genuine, legitimate alternative. And clearly, people responded to it very strongly indeed.
I don't know if you watched the Mamdani speech, or if you've seen the clips where he does directly address not only Trump, but speaks directly to the circumstances that allowed Trump and Trump's sort of fascism to rise. I don't know. For me, I think it hits harder than anything that I've seen any other Democrat put out in the past 12 months. And I know that you've written, Charlie, a lot about the Democratic response to the first 12 months of his presidency, how limp it has been, how they just really have not seemed to meet the moment. Interesting that Jesse said that Chuck Schumer was getting bigger boos than Trump early on in the night at the DSA.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting, but not really surprising that Chuck Schumer, who's a fellow New York Democrat, a senator, one of the real leadership figures, he did not endorse Mamdani, nor did the state representatives Tom Suozzi or Laurie Gillen. New York Democratic Senator Kristen Gillibrand also said horrible things about Mamdani, that he referenced global jihad. She eventually had to call and apologize for that. Yeah, no. So the Democratic leadership, and this is again goes back to what I was saying before about they have the option now, and I think they will take it, to interpret this as an outlier, as something that is only in New York. The articulate way that Mamdani has been able to deal with the appeal of Trump. He interviewed a lot of New Yorkers who had either not voted at all or voted for Trump, and just listen to them and talk to them about why they thought that was. And it is noteworthy that he's not alone in terms of his approach. He was again, there's a lot about the atmospherics around Mamdani, and that I think is fair, and I don't think that's insubstantial in terms of his importance or significance. But he was a very, very material and economically focused, policy kind of driven campaign. He was very focused and very on message about what he was trying to achieve. And that actually is probably true of all the Democrats who won this week. It was always affordability, the cost of living kind of focus was kind of a big thing that they would run on, because obviously that was a huge factor in Trump succeeding last year, was that he promised to bring prices down. The recurring gag of "we all got fascism because we wanted cheaper eggs" kind of thing. But that is certainly something that hasn't happened under Trump, and I think the Democrats see that as a real opportunity and a real area of attack.
Like you say, not to undercut how it feels, because it does feel, Mamdani's win does feel historic. It feels very meaningful to a lot of people. But even I, following this race online from the other side of the world, I could have rattled off those 5 policy points.
Yeah,
If someone had
yeah.
stopped me in the street and asked what they were, like, it was very consistent. It was very on message. But yeah, this was not a vibes based campaign. I mean, in contrast, I don't know that I could have said what Andrew Cuomo's vision for the city. I mean, a lot of people did talk about, like, clearly you could see that Mamdani had a real love for New York City, but like what Cuomo was promising to do, I could not tell you. And to go back to the 2024 presidential election, that was one of the criticisms, whether it was, I mean, maybe you'll have a view on whether it was warranted or not, but that Kamala Harris's campaign was not really, really clear on what specifically and materially it would do, because it was kind of mounted more as a stop Trump type of campaign. I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, no, I would say there's a huge element of truth to that, and I think there's there are parallels you could draw between Cuomo and Harris in this way, is that they were primarily defensive campaigns. They were campaigns that were, I'm going to save you from this radical, from the right in Trump's case, from the left in Mamdani's case, and that whether that's a fair kind of picture of what their policy platform was, that was the message that came through. Well, that's why Cuomo had some horrific moments where, for example, he was always talking about Mamdani's lack of experience, the fact that he's not got the ability to govern a 300,000 strong public workforce and $120 billion budget and all that thing. If there's a major crisis, how's he going to deal with it? And of course, then you find yourself laughing along with a podcast host who suggested he would actually cheer if another 9/11 happened. Had to walk that back, but it shows that you are that when that's your kind of the meat of your campaign in some ways, or the meat of your messaging, it's much harder to reject horrific attacks against your opponent, because it's all part of your it all helps your armory. And I was reminded, I think there's obviously, it's interesting that we haven't talked about any parallels with, say, the campaign of someone like Barack Obama. And it is a measure for me of the kind of where we are at in terms of the discourse, if we can use that word. There's a very famous moment in the first campaign that Obama undertook for president, where he was up against Republican John McCain. And again, I think that also represented a very similar new politics, old politics kind of split. During one of his events, McCain is approached by a questioner who talks about the fact that Barack Obama is a secret Muslim and hates our country, and McCain politely but firmly says that's not correct. He and I have huge differences about how we feel politics should be run or how the country should be run, but he is a good man and a loyal American, something along those lines. And of course, that kind of interaction has become increasingly unimaginable in 2025 and post-Trump. I think the other thing, not that we should necessarily use every opportunity to slam the Harris campaign, but I think one thing that you would have to say that I don't think Cuomo fell victim to that Harris did was that there was a confusion in this defensive posture, because she would say in one sentence that this is the most important election in American history. Democracy is on the line. We don't want a fascist kind of running America. But then she would say, and I'm going to reach across the aisle when I'm in a power, and I'm going to make sure that we get Republicans in my administration. You can't really argue both of those things and come across as coherent. Whereas I don't think Cuomo said, but I will reach out to the Democratic Socialist Party and make sure I get their advice once I'm in power.
No, I mean, interestingly, Trump kind of endorsed Cuomo, or said that he would be that would be the best mayor of New York. Which, I mean, I feel like that probably did help Mamdani. Maybe he didn't need the help by that point, but it certainly wasn't a good look.
No, again, I think that is something I think Chuck Schumer ought to perhaps reflect on the fact that he is only a notch away from endorsing the same candidate as Donald Trump. I think you should reflect on how well you're opposing a president if you, by your silence, are implicitly endorsing the same person as he is. Yeah, it's a real sign of where the Democratic leadership is at. That a few hard right figures said, "Look, I hate Cuomo as much as the next guy." They would hate him from a progressive point of view, but if it's a choice between him and a 100% communist lunatic like Mamdani, then it's got to be Cuomo. Sliwa is not going to make it. And yes, Sliwa's run before, and Sliwa managed 27%, I think, of the vote. Usually that's been the kind of rough cutoff that the Republican camp enjoyed over the last decade or so, maybe a bit longer. Of course, because a lot of people who would have otherwise voted for him voted for Cuomo. That's kind of why you see that huge drop off. Although it's interesting to note that I believe it was NBC did an exit poll that polled the people who voted for Sliwa, and it was actually pretty much 50-50. They said if Sliwa wasn't on the ballot, it was about 50-50 who would have voted for Cuomo and who would have voted for Mamdani, which is an interesting little stat. And I think, obviously, again, Jesse has done some really wonderful work, and he's talked to some of the MAGA for Mamdani types, which is, a really interesting kind of subplot to all this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there was a lot of discussion and content online about how even Mamdani supporters really enjoyed Sliwa's contributions, seemed to kind of relish in just how much Curtis Sliwa hates Andrew Cuomo as well. I mean, that was like a very interesting dynamic. We won't get into his kind of complicated story in politics in this podcast episode, but I'm curious, just to put a bow on this, Charlie. Am I understanding correctly that you don't think that this election win for Mamdani or the other wins that the Democrats had this week is going to really re-energize their fight against Trump to look particularly different to how it has? Am I reading that correct?
It's an open question, and I think there's a few factors that will really determine this. It's very, very clear that for America's political right wing, Mamdani is the new nemesis. The next time there's a major crime that happens in New York City, it's going to be Mamdani's fault. It's going to be Mamdani out of control immigration, etc., etc. That is, you can lock that in. That will definitely happen. The question then becomes, what is Mamdani as effective a politician as he was a campaigner? To quote Andrew Cuomo's father, Mario, he has a beautiful quote, which is, you campaign in poetry, but you have to govern in prose. You have to, you can be as grand and eloquent as you want on the campaign trail, but the reality of governing will tell. And obviously, for all of the detail and the policy that Mamdani has put forward in terms of rent freezes in rent controlled apartments and free public transport and issues of that sort, a New York mayor can't just unilaterally impose that legislation. There are various independent bodies that he has maybe influence over, but has to negotiate with and has to kind of bring along to his side. As we've established, the Democratic leadership hasn't always been as helpful in that regard as they might be. There's another interesting subplot here, which is Kathy Hochul, who is the current New York governor, Democrat. She did eventually endorse Mamdani. And obviously Jesse has written a wonderful piece about the reception she got at his at some of the events that she attended with Mamdani. She's up for re-election next year, and there's a question about how radical, how risky is she willing to go with her support for what Mamdani does? How much help is she going to be willing to give him with some of these more kind of risky propositions to ultimately, I mean, again, the thing that we haven't really made explicit, which is so almost so obvious, doesn't need to be made explicit, but the big debate in the current Democratic Party is between the base that will form the future of that party, younger, more progressive, more multicultural, and where their money comes from, which is who have very, very different interests and very, very different concerns. Whether Hochul is willing to go for the future and rather than the money, that will be really, really interesting. Say, for example, with the coming midterms, will he still be in the honeymoon period? Will he have had a few big wins? Will people be noticeably better off under his mayoral mayoralty? I think it's mayoralty. Under his tenure. Yeah, under his tenure. Or will he have hit some real roadblocks? Will he have found himself kind of stymied in the things he's trying to achieve? Will people start feeling that they're actually no better off, or will they be convinced that they're actually worse off under him? And that will, I think, determine how much of his approach the kind of broader Democrats' strategy will take on. The other thing that I think you will see is Mamdani's fluency in a lot of languages, it turns out, but the language of social media has obviously been very influential in his campaign. He has managed to get his message to the right people and do it in a way where he seems very at ease in that kind of world, in a way that very, very few politicians are able to do. The worry is that they take the atmospherics part of it. All right, I'm going to do TikTok now, but I'm nowhere near as good at it because I'm not 34 and young and handsome and energetic. And they might find that backfires, and then they'll be like, well, the Mamdani playbook just doesn't work outside New York. Whereas the material concerns will kind of go by the wayside.
Yeah, that actually brings us very nicely to the next part of this conversation, which is us trying to make this about Australia now as much as we can. Because of the incredible, I would say almost flawless digital campaign that Mamdani ran, a lot of politically engaged people, I should say, in Australia were following this quite closely because it was in all of our feeds. One element of that is just because of how globalized media is at the moment, and how much, if you are an Australian who is interested in politics, you will be pretty aggressively served up US politics on digital platforms, whether you like it or not. That's just the way it goes. That's certainly one aspect of it. But I think also there is truth to the fact that Mamdani is a young guy who is going up against, big money political establishment, trying to take up issues that people in Australia absolutely relate to, like the cost of housing, cost of living, welfare inequality. These are all absolutely issues in Australia. And we spoke a little bit already about just the respect and integrity in public life and engaging in politics, to see him navigate that so eloquently and still maintain, his own personality and joy and light, even as people were saying the most horrific things about him. To watch his speech and to see him say, New York is a city of immigrants. It will remain a city of immigrants at a time when ICE is literally swiping people off the street across the states. In Australia, we have neo-Nazis trying to start political parties, and Pauline Hanson is trying to ban the burqa again. It makes you, I couldn't help but be moved by that. It does make you emotional because you get to see someone run a very serious campaign, but also a joyful campaign, a fun campaign, and to see them win, I think has been very inspiring to a lot of people on the left in Australia. But obviously our political landscapes are very different. The actual mechanics of these elections and of the way that politics is done in America versus Australia are very different. So I guess we do have to be kind of careful of, we can take the inspiration, but does that mean that the campaign playbook, does that mean those policy ideas would work here? I think is a different question. For your 2 cents, Charlie, is there anything that you would pluck out of this and say, if it's not direct lesson, it's at least something to think about, or it's something that could be applicable to us in Oz?
Yeah, it's an interesting question and a big one. And I think there's a few ways that you can look at it. When we were first discussing what we would talk about today, and I was not dismissive of this question, but I kind of thought, I think it's pretty limited in terms of the direct political influence that this will have on Australia. And I think there's a few different reasons why I still kind of do think that. I think for one thing, as you sort of said, that it's a different polity in so many different ways. The US is a different polity. For vast swathes of that population, America feels like a failed state in a way that I don't think Australia really has. There are obviously, huge issues with inequality. There are a lot of people who are struggling. There are a lot of, issues with services, issues with rural communities, with indigenous communities. I don't want to downplay any of that, but there's not a widespread sense of decay like there is in pretty much every major city in the US. So the room for a left populist to really say, it was, again, a big part of his messaging was, it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be this hard. And in fact, it's in the interest of the other people competing for your vote in this election. It's in their direct interest that it stays this hard. And I don't have those interests. That is an argument I think that would probably cut through in most places. I think, again, it's to once again kind of call on the Obama parallel. there is the sense, and I don't want to make too lazy a parallel, because there are obviously huge differences in some ways. But I think the thing that they do share is what they ultimately proved was, yeah, you can be the first black president, and you can be progressive, and you can be young, and you can give the sense that you have some idea of what it is to be young and what it is to live a normal life. And in Mamdani's case, you can have some quite genuinely left-wing policies, and you can win as long as you are an immaculate candidate, as long as you basically don't put a foot wrong, as long as you are a profoundly gifted orator, as long as your team is completely across how to get your message to the exact people who need it. I mean, and that is, I mean, and so that is the thing that you've got to sort of compare, I suppose, to what it is to be right wing in the US and most places, where it's like you can be a transparent shambles and it doesn't seem to matter, because you're arguing to different people and offering them different things, I suppose. For the same reason that we haven't seen a really widespread far right movement in Australia have, major electoral success, it's probably the same reason why, for example, we've seen the Greens getting wiped out at the last federal election, is that the middle range is much wider in terms of like basic material needs being covered. That spreads much wider in Australia than it does in the US. Our safety net is incomparable to them. I mean, that is a funny thing. When I was last over in the US for Trump's election, speaking to people on the streets, they would ask about Australia and the things that, you would talk about, some of the things that John Howard or any number of very conservative prime ministers would not go near. Gun control, universal healthcare, those kind of things would get you laughed out of town as a socialist in the US. So there's a fundamentally different understanding of government and its role, which makes it harder to kind of draw direct parallels. We do, I mean, that said, we love to import a bullshit culture war from the US. So I suspect that Mamdani, unfortunately, will just become another figure that people like Ralph Babbitt tweet about constantly, because they've not got anything else to do. And for example, you mentioned the return to trying to ban the burqa. I do wonder if that could be a coincidence, or whether that's something that Hansen will try to pin on the fact that we now have. We haven't even really touched upon the weaponization of anti-Semitism against Mamdani, but I can't believe that won't come up as a talking point for a lot of the harder right in Australia, as further evidence of the kind of the curdling anti-Semitism of the public square.
I mean, Pauline Hanson was just in the States with Trump at his Mar-a-Lago Halloween parties. I'm sure it was much discussed. I'm not even joking when I say that. I am 100% sure that Trump was bringing Mamdani up and bitching about him to anyone who would listen. Put this same sort of question to a few different people I know kind of across the spectrum of the Australian left to get their initial take on this, how it might play out in Australia. And the responses were more varied than I expected, I think. This group of people, if I had to map out like the political ideology in a way that people would understand, I would say it would go from like the leftmost edges of the Labor Party through to Till progressive ideology, Greens, and also Vic socialists. So, of quite a few touch points across the Australian left. The first thing, it is very, very clear that multiple election campaigns in 2026 will be categorically, they are going to draw heavy inspiration from Mamdani's campaign, if not just explicitly, trying to reproduce it, which will be really interesting to see. A lot of people mentioned that they were very buoyed by the fact that a left-wing candidate could win and not really be dragged too much into the culture wars. I mean, you mentioned that discussions around Israel and Gaza and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, that was a part of this campaign, but Mamdani didn't throw the queer community under the bus. He did not equivocate on Israel's genocide against Palestinians. Like, he was able to do these things. He didn't have to make those concessions in order to win, which is what a lot of the centre-left often will say that they have to do to have these sort of achievements.
I think it is very worth mentioning that that's in a city with one of the highest Jewish populations outside of Israel anywhere in the world.
Yes, absolutely. So, the fact that he felt he could really stick to that line and win, and he proved that he can, I think a lot of people are paying attention to and taking very seriously. But when it comes to the actual policies, I think it was much more split about whether people think that these platforms could work here. I had one really interesting conversation with a strategist about like just how different the housing conversation is in New York City specifically versus Australia, because New York City has such a high portion of renters, but they also have those pricing control factors that are already built in a completely normal part of their system with rent control and rent stabilization. That's controlled by a rent board, and the mayor has the ability to appoint people to that rental board. Like, they already have those functions, whereas in Australia, it would be very difficult for a candidate to effectively balance the landlords versus renters conversation, because that plays out here more as like a mum and dad landlords don't want the prices of their homes to go down. It's a much more delicate conversation and a much trickier sort of needle to thread here in a lot of ways.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that that's true. The role of the real estate mogul in the history of New York and its conception of itself and in shaping its politics is huge. And obviously Donald Trump is just the most famous example of that. Yeah, you're right. That is much less. There's a much less of a narrative. You basically hit the nail on the head. There's not the same. This is just a good solid middle class family who are trying to invest and do the best for their family. That's much less of a thread that happens. It's
these are like incredibly wealthy property developers who are owning these. Obviously there are examples of individual families where they've held that apartment or whatever it will be for years, but it's just a totally different conversation. And I can't take credit for that at all. This was completely somebody else who I spoke to. But then I thought the most fascinating part of this, to come back to like what you were saying about, Mamdani, in many ways like Barack Obama, you can't deny is just a pure talent. It's just incredibly gifted. And there were some real question marks about whether the Australian left could produce someone like that, partly because we don't have big bad villain to position against as in the unifying way. Labor, for as much as people on the left would see this Labor government as incredibly disappointing, I think that it's unquestionable that Labor has had a drift to the right from the party that we talk about of decades ago. This Labor government has a terrible track record on transparency. Like, there's a lot going on. But as a villain, ultimately, it's still kind of mid.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to like mount, for the left specifically, this big campaign around a villain that ultimately I think a lot of the Australian public is like, it sucks, but it could be worse. Whereas it did seem, there was one person who I spoke to who had also spent some time living in New York, and they sort of pointed to the fact that Mamdani didn't just pop out of nowhere. This is quite a long game that's been played out over 10 years, really driven by the DSA and other Labor organisations and left-wing organisations, building these campaigns and building the networks in opposition to the emergence of Trump as far back as before 2016. And so, it seems like there are big questions for the people in that space here locally in Australia about whether that's even possible to do, given the landscape that we've got. Peter Dutton, you would think, was the closest thing to a Trump villain that we've had in a while, and he was pretty easily defeated at the end of the day, sent packing from his own seat. So that was, I thought, just an interesting mix of opinions of how people are interpreting this here. One thing that I'd be interested to see, and I don't think we should be totally surprised if this happens, is seeing this turn some younger progressive people onto local government as an option, because obviously Mamdani is the mayor of New York City. He's not the governor of New York. Like, this wasn't a big election in that sense. So I do wonder if we'll see people start to pay attention to more local Australian politics, municipal Australian politics. That would be kind of an interesting thing to see. I don't know if you have a view on that.
Yeah, that was the first. I remember seeing, I believe it's a Batuta piece that came out this morning where it's like, oh, I'm so happy Zohran 1 says Australian lefty who doesn't know who their local mayor is or what party they're from. And there is an element of that, of course, because local government in Australia really does run under the radar until there's a massive corruption scandal. The other big kind of thing in the last decade or so has been controversies around Greens-controlled councils changing the protocol around Australia Day and citizenship, things like that. So it bubbles up mildly when it when it refers to an issue that is being played out in other places in more prominent political circles. It's an interesting question. I must confess I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. It's possible. It's possible. Again, there is no, maybe the Sydney mayor and maybe the Melbourne mayor, but even then they're not glamorous like the New York City mayor is. They don't produce national figures in quite the same way. Although
How dare you? How dare you not say that Melbourne is the most glamorous city in the world?
How dare I besmirch Nicholas Rees and Clover Moore in this way?
Moore. Well, Charlie, I think we'll leave it there. I mean, there is so much more that could be said about this, but I guess now it is really the wait and see. Mamdani will be officially sworn in on the 1st of January. Then the city is his to run, and we'll keep an eye on how that plays out. And yeah, I would say to people, definitely keep an eye on state elections next year, local elections next year, because I would be very shocked to not see, I mean, even down to like the graphic design elements of Mamdani's campaign, I think we'll see a lot of aspects of that trickle through Australian politics over the next 12 months, as is the Australian way. Thanks so much for your time today, Charlie.
Thanks, Kestel.
If you're listening to us on a podcast app, don't forget to subscribe, rate and review Cut Through. And if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel. It all helps Crikey grow and gets our independent journalism out to more people. That's all for now. We'll be back next week.